Okay. I'm going to lock this in a couple of seconds. All right. So next question, what is your age? Younger than 18 is A, 18 to 35 is B, 36 to 50 is C, 51 to 65 is D, and over 65 is E. We have a good range of people. That's great. Okay, okay, still changing. I'm gonna lock this in a couple of seconds, giving you guys the last chance to send your answers. Okay. And the last question. What is your zip code? So again, we're just getting an idea of who's in the room. You can type in your answer and it'll show up on the screen. Once the number gets larger, it means that a lot of people are sending the same question, the same answer in. So right now it looks like we have a lot of people answering through the 32266 zip code. All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. And all right, thank you. All right, so we're going to get into site design standards. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to send your questions in the Q&A button. We have our really great team that can answer those as I'm presenting. So feel free to do that. All right, so this is your existing Neptune Beach building and site standards table. So what you see here is you have your standards for the zoning districts here. You'll see the zoning districts along the left side. And then we've identified which standards could be worked on. So for example, the minimum lot area and lot width, we could work on those to maybe discourage oversized lots and homes in inappropriate areas. We could also look at the front yard setbacks, side yard setbacks, and corner lot side yard setbacks to maybe include something that includes maximums colors, shades of colors will show a little bit more intensity. So transit zones range from natural zone T1 to very urban T6. That's not to say that Neptune Beach will have that, but just showing you a range of variety of what the urban environment looks like in each transit zone. This is just an idea or giving you an idea of what building types look like with building standards. You can really define what a lot width looks like, what the building height looks like. You can get into where the gallery location for building is, walls and forecourts, things like that. Also, you can really define how to position a building in relation to the primary and secondary streets. These diagrams are really great at explaining exactly what your primary street is and a secondary street. There's also great maps that we could do to really define in Neptune Beach, what are your primary streets and secondary streets defined as. So what are these building standards? So these are regulations that control the features, configurations, and functions of buildings that define and shape the building environment. This is a list of them, and we'll go through them one by one. So your build-to line or build-to zone. So this one's describing what it looks like for a T6. This is a very urban environment. And as you can see, the build-to location is a 0-foot minimum and 10-foot maximum. This arrow shows you where that building frontage, that wall, can be positioned. So you can build it within that 10-foot range right there. And then the T3 transit zone, this is very different. So this is more of your residential areas, and your minimum could be 18 feet. So this is very different than a very urban environment. You can have ranges of building locations within these areas and transit zones. And next we get into rear and side setbacks. And what's important here is that we define in these diagrams, what is your rear and side setback? So a lot of times people will see a map and they won't really be able to read it, and they won't know what's my front, what's my side, or what's my rear. And this really defines what those are. And it tells you as well, you know, your side street setback is 0 foot minimum or 10 foot maximum. This is very common in a very urban environment. So building frontage defines a percentage of what the building wall should be at. So here in the front, it tells you that there should be an 80-foot minimum. That means that 80% of the building wall should cover, or 80% of the lot should be covered by that wall. And then the side street, and this is very common for a corner. So if you're not at a corner lot, you probably won't have a side street building facade building front built out. You can also get into yard encroachments. So these yard encroachments really, you can really define what an encroachment line is. And this can really help you establish where, like for example, a wall can go, or what can be encroached into the side setback or the front setback. So this sometimes can get into the following, like for example, what a porch, where do you put a porch? Where do you put your stoop? Where does the driveway go? And you really, you know, you're able to define that in these type of graphics and charts. So for example, here, a porch projecting onto the front can go into 5 feet into the actual front setback.
Hey, Brenda, just add something to that. So the setbacks are a way to define where the primary building walls can be located. But we heard in a couple of past meetings, you know, there are architectural elements, maybe a balcony on the second floor or a porch, or even on-street dining potentially in like a downtown area, where you might want to be able to have some portion of the building go beyond those setbacks. And that's what this kind of regulation that you're seeing would enable. It would define the types of elements that can encroach upon that setback line. And you can define by how much, how wide, and you know how far it will project.
Right.
Hey, Louisa, this is Carrie. And
Sure.
I could give an example that's specifically happened here during one of my planning board meetings. There was a home that was built up to the setback line on the side, and they had a roof projection, and that roof projection went beyond the setback line. So that roof projection needed a variance, and they had to come before the board for that. So in this case, if we enact some kind of encroachment zone, then that would have taken care of that roof projection, correct?
Yes, that's correct. You can define an actual line like the previous slide Brenda showed, right? You have an encroachment zone, or you can actually define certain elements and how far they're allowed to actually project.
So for the public, if they're listening in, then something like this would eliminate the need for them to come before the variance board.
That's correct.
Right. Okay.
Exactly, and there can be a set of dimensions, for instance, that overhangs can be up to 2 or 3 feet without requiring a variance. And if somebody wanted to go further, there would still be the variance possibility. But yeah, in the Florida climate, it doesn't really make sense to have a building without a foot or a couple feet of overhang. And the code really should encourage and allow that, rather than making somebody jump through hoops to do something that's just sensible in our climate.
That's right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all for that clarification. So this next graphic just gives you an example of that same thing. So where your porch can go into your stoop, and it really defines the depth, the size, the width, all of that, and can get very clear I think this is very beneficial for anyone that's doing any type of renovations for, their home, anything like that. Next standard is lot coverage. So typically you'll have a standard that tells you what percentage a building can cover the lot. And you already have this standard within Neptune Beach. We think it's great. This is just a diagram showing you what that would look like if you had a building footprint covering the entire lot or 25%, et cetera. So then we get into building height. You can really define how building a height is actually measured, and you can really define even ground floor height and ceiling heights. And one thing to note with the star here is there are footnotes, and you can really define very specifically even the definition of what a story means or where to measure the actual top and bottom of the building. So it gets very clear. You can also get into off-street parking location and sharing. This is very useful for not just urban areas, but also residential areas. So for example, in some cases, you can really define what a driveway width is, what the landscape setback is, what the actual side setback for a driveway is, so that maybe somebody doesn't build the driveway up to the actual side property line. And of course, you can get into commercial parking parking standards and things like that. Again, land use by floor. Here you can define in certain transect areas and spaces, locations, what you want the ground floor to be, and whatever other floors you want it to be. So here, for example, the ground floor is commercial, the second, third could be anything else to be determined based on the city's, like whatever you guys would like to or decide to do, you can really define that in the transit zones and standards.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Brenda, before you move on. So we're well aware that council took a position on what can be included in mixed use buildings and zones. And so we're, very aware of the sentiment and desire for the community to keep residential out of mixed use zones. So in this scenario, in places where you do have a 2 and even potentially 3-story buildings, you can define very clearly in the new code that the second floor could be some combination of lodging, hotel, or office space, or whatever the uses may be that are desirable on the second and third floors.
Thank you. So this great graphic or this chart shows you what you can do and how you can differentiate between building types. So instead of just having one type of width or type of like building height, things like that for maybe just single family and applying it to all, you can actually apply it depending on what type of duplex it is. So if you have a duplex that's side by side, you can really get into the specifics of what that looks like. Or if you have a duplex that's front and back or stacked or large house, even into getting things into like accessory structures and dwelling units here, and multifamily like bungalow courts. So next we're going to get into building height. First, we'll go over what's existing in your current code. So the way that it's defined is you measure from 1 foot above the crown of the road, and I'll show you with the next diagram. So you're able to measure from the 1 foot above the crown of the road to the top of the roof. So this is the existing definition for buildings, for building height.
So this is what the Neptune Beach Code currently defines for measuring building height.
Right. And then within the code, it also has exceptions. So those exceptions include church steeples, chimneys, and other structures that are not occupied. Then you also get into flagpoles, water towers, And then damaged buildings over 35 feet may be rebuilt to their original height. So these are just some of the exceptions to note. Again, this is the existing chart in your code. There is already maximum building heights. They go from 28 to 35, 35 being your maximum. And there's a footnote here for R1, but it specifies more of what type of lot size and roof type. And it allows for an exception to up to 35 feet based on that type of roof, but it cannot exceed more than 2 stories. So this is the only location that really defines, it gets into more definition or more specificity. So some of those current regulations and limitations really limit the variety of roof types and designs that are possible within Neptune Beach. So the result is substandard ground floor retail heights in commercial areas when they're trying to accommodate maybe a 3-story building. So we don't really see anything that specify first floor heights, which could be an issue. And they don't consider and accommodate changing conditions, like for example, when a crown of a road is changed over time or repaved or elevated. And then also it doesn't account for base flood elevations, which can put an additional burden on homeowners in high hazard areas, which are also subject to change over time. So how do we measure height? And we understand that it's not something that we're changing. The maximum building height will remain the same. We're not considering changing that, but we could look at how it's measured, which could be beneficial to the community. So this is just an example of how we could measure 2 different types of buildings. You have a flat roof on the left and a pitched roof on the right. So a flat roof could be measured up to the top of the parapet, and a pitched roof could be measured from the bottom of the eave. Again, the definitions or standards really can get into how tall you want a ground floor to be. This could be very beneficial, again, for like commercial areas, even office uses. And you can really define what the ceiling height is there too.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, Brenda, about your comment earlier. So the 35-foot height limit might mean that there are developers who will come in your town center and want to squeeze in a 3-story building, for example. It's possible that it wouldn't give you a really good ground floor storefront because you would have to be making it a lot shorter to accommodate those 2 additional stories than you would otherwise want. Typically, ground floor retail has much taller floor to ceiling heights, allows more light in, and just makes for a more pleasing shop front. So those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. You might want to set specifically for a ground floor commercial a minimum height.
Thank you, Louisa.
Sure.
And then next we have pitch roof. So how do we measure that? And you can measure that from the bottom of the eave. Also, again, you can really define what you want if you want 1-story minimum, 2-story max, and get into definition of where to measure that, and if you want to have a different type of ceiling height, etc. So lastly, you can measure height from base flood elevation. So as a barrier island, Neptune Beach, you all know all of the constraints that you have with living on the coast. This is a changing environment, and you see that a lot of areas here have the possibility of flooding. So essentially what you could do is set standards in place where within those areas that are at risk of flooding, so the flood hazard areas, you can measure it from base flood elevation, and you could add a minimum of how much you add to that. So let me go back and show for outside of those areas, there's typically already an 18-inch required floor elevation. And that's very standard, just so that you don't have a floor that's just straight on the ground floor, on the elevation, And then you add 12-foot max for an optional freeboard. And then you have your base flood, your base building elevation or your finished floor height. And so then for a special flood hazard area, you can add that, and you can add the 12 inches minimum for the Florida building code that requires, and that's required in coastal high hazard areas. And then you can add the optional freeboard. So Louisa, jump in if anything
Sure.
clarified.
So essentially right now, the base of your measurement in Neptune Beach is the crown of the road plus 1 foot. And that plus 1 foot gets you to basically what the typical required floor elevation is. You never want a building sitting right at the same level of the site. You know, any rain event could become an issue in that situation, especially residential floors. You want slightly elevated, and that's typical. Now, in areas of flooding, whether that's a special flood hazard area or a coastal high hazard area, what you're adding onto the average crown of the road is the base flood elevation, which varies, and you can find those on your FEMA maps. And say your base flood elevation is 5 feet, 5 to 7 feet above NAVD. And I'll say that that's a flood, that's 5, so let's say it's 5 feet above that. That's not necessarily 5 feet above the crown of the road. So you'd have to make sure that's something you have to talk with the city and Public Works to get a good understanding and survey of your site to see, you know, right now what the elevation of the crown of the road is and go from there. But the point is that base flood elevation is something that's constantly changing. FEMA revises their maps, and you don't want to be penalizing homes that are in coastal high hazard areas with the height requirements if their first finished floor of their building is necessarily increasing as the base flood elevation increases over time. So a lot of coastal communities are measuring building height more and more from the base flood elevation or from the base flood elevation plus some optional freeboard height.
Thank you. So what is the freeboard? A freeboard is the height of a building above FEMA's base flood elevation for a specific site. So regulations often require at least 1 foot of freeboard for elevated buildings. Each foot of freeboard lowers flood insurance rates up to a maximum of 4 feet. So this could be very beneficial to your community. And this is another diagram that just shows how the usable, livable height can be measured differently than the actual maximum building height. So this again shows what like the base flood elevation here. This A zone and V zone is different because of the different the elevations, the difference in elevation there.
And so freeboard is something to keep in mind. There are insurance benefits to building slightly higher than the base flood elevation. Base flood elevation is the bare minimum that you can build to in a specific flood hazard zone. And so there are incentives for people to build above that up to 4 feet. And again, that's something to consider when you're measuring the overall building height.
All right, so we got into the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please let us know in the Q&A button.
There was one question by Nicholas, and I think we answered it. It was about architectural embellishments, including windmills, solar panels, or other protrusions, and how that impacts height. And I think you pretty much mentioned it already. The existing code does have exceptions for height, such as steeples or different architectural elements, depending on the zone and what the building type is. Solar panels is curious. I haven't seen that specific provision. I can't imagine it would add too much to the overall height, but that is something we could look into.
On that subject, I think something you're more likely to see to be controversial and difficult is somebody putting a rooftop deck on top of a 2-story house, particularly when you suddenly can get a view over the dune of the ocean. And there are some now in Neptune Beach, not a lot, but in coastal communities, sometimes those little, great little place to get up and get a view. It can sometimes expand in almost like an additional floor of the building. So the language that, any exception language for that kind of thing has to be carefully written. So it's maybe a small place to sit, not an entire story. So it can be done by, maybe a certain number of square feet could be a rooftop deck, but not any more square feet, or a certain percentage of the floor area of the building. So these little exceptions actually are complicated. They can be, particularly in your community, I think on rooftop decks. If you don't word this carefully, I think you'll find in 5 or 10 years what's happened really on coastal communities around the state is they can go from something that's pretty cool and adds character to something that can be very character changing. So we have experience in doing that other places, and we can give suggestions to you on what good standards would be. I also haven't seen solar panels being an issue. Solar panels mounted on a roof, they're flat on a roof, and therefore they might raise it 6 inches. There are some benefits in solar panels to raising them a foot or 2 feet above the roof, because the solar panel is it operates better when it's 6 inches or a foot or 12 or 15 inches above the roof. But again, it's not an exception. There would be a pretty minor one, wouldn't have to be more, because it's unlikely to have panels going really above the top of the roof.
So we have a couple more questions. One question is, I understand Miami recently adopted height changes to follow those utilized by some of the keys. Please discuss how these cities already dealing with severe flooding. Are these going on pylons, stilts, etc.? And at what point do you experience diminishing returns in terms of the savings on flood insurance?
That's a much larger question.
Yeah, it really is. That the difficulty here is local governments have some control over these issues, but less than you would think. And that's because the National Flood Insurance Program, which is for the most part the way that everybody can buy flood insurance for their houses or their businesses, it's a federal program, and the federal government doesn't want to be subsidizing people to build buildings that are going to be likely to flood. So the federal government creates these maps that Brenda's been talking about, and they create the map, and they say in this, for instance, there'll be a map of Neptune Beach, and it'll show a series of lines, and they'll say west of this line, the house has to be 7 feet above mean sea level, and here it has to be 8 feet, and here it has to be 9 feet. And this is based on computer models that they create that simulate the effects of storms offshore and how much water they're going to push up. So they create these maps, but under the federal program, they make cities and counties adopt them. So the city and county has to adopt them whether they like them or not. And if FEMA comes back 7 years later and says our old computer model was pretty lousy, and here's the new maps, which they do all the time, the city has to adopt the new maps. And when I say has to, if the city doesn't, nobody in that city can buy flood insurance. I mean, the penalty is so draconian that the cities don't really have any choice. So where the cities do have choice is they can say, okay, FEMA's models, have been too low in the past. We've had floods that have been higher. And so we want everybody to build 1 foot higher. And that's the freeboard that Brenda and Louise have been talking about, freeboard. We want everybody to build 1 foot higher than the bare minimum, or 2 feet higher or 3 feet higher. So that's within the control of a local government. The tricky part is you want your, as we've been talking about tonight, you want your code to be able to, if suddenly the buildings have to be 2 feet higher than before, you'd like the roof to go up 2 feet also, so people don't lose 2 feet of their allowable building area. You need to be able to do that. So you have to go back and keep amending those height regulations every time FEMA decides they want to change the flood maps. So when you have to elevate to this level, the question here was, do you do this on stilts? How do you do it? And again, it depends on the flood maps. Generally for homes, people will raise the house on stilts because then they can use, the under part for parking. But for a home it's your choice. If you want to, add fill, you can add fill instead of raising on pilings. Of course, in a community like Neptune Beach, raising fill can put an awful lot of flood water on your just normal rainfall onto your next door neighbor. So that's difficult as well. And so Neptune Beach would be within its rights to say, if you're going to go up, you need to do it on stilts just to protect the neighbors from being flooded out. So there are also some more complicated regulations for commercial buildings, whether you can go up on stilts or not. And that could be a whole evening that I could bore you with, but I'll stop here unless there are more questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of diminishing returns, that's really a larger question that's tied to, land values and financing homes into the future, of how much to invest in elevating your home, at what point to make that investment. And that's kind of a moving target. I think in the immediate, it's very much tied to, are you meeting at least the standards required to qualify for flood insurance? And that will be very important for resale value of the home. But it's a very large topic, and one that Bill and I could certainly talk about a lot more. And so there's a question here about accessory structure heights. Right now, are there going to be any changes for R1 and R2? And I certainly think that accessory structures, it would make a lot of sense for them to have their own regulations as well, as they do already. And so deciding what the desirable height of any particular accessory structures, and of course they don't all have to be the same. You can have a garage that has certain standards for that building type. You could have a garage which is a carriage house that maybe allows a second story, and then if you're going to allow a carriage house, that could also have very specific height requirements. Or if it's a shed, it would have a different set of requirements. So that's something that we can definitely look closely into to make sure that the existing regulations for those different types of accessory uses are appropriate. And where there is ambiguity in the code, button that up and make it a lot more specific.
So we want to open it up. We see there's 11 people joined. If you want to raise your hand and speak to us directly and ask your question, we can unmute you, and you can ask your questions or comments. We're happy to do that. So if anybody wants to speak, you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk.
And it can be a comment as well, if you all feel one way or the other, if you tend to agree that measuring to accommodate for elevating buildings and flood prone areas, we're interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
And if there's any questions about the first piece of the presentation, which is more about actual site standards, setbacks, things like that.
So I saw there was one question that was answered, but I think maybe other people might have missed it. So it says, in Jack's speech, there are a few houses that have effectively added an open air top story as a deck with the roof, but no walls. So I see Bill answered it. Would you like to answer it for the larger group?
Yes, I was just saying, I'm actually surprised that we haven't seen that in Neptune Beach yet, because what you're mentioning, we're seeing all over the state in coastal communities. So there's two things that happen in a place like Neptune Beach. Suddenly the new homes will be extremely large. If the code allows it, they'll be sometimes way oversized. And other times they'll take advantage of a loophole in regulations that haven't been carefully written, and will do things like make the rooftop deck an entire story. And then, of course, if people get away with that, then they put a little roof over the open deck and it's a roof deck. And then suddenly there are walls and so that's why I say that the code can be worded to deal with that, and the time to do that is before people start building that sort of thing. I mean, you can always go back and try and fix it later, but what we see is somebody will do one and they get away with it, and suddenly there's 10 in the next year. And so, we want to head that off and make sure that doesn't happen.
Unless of course it's something that the community wants. So if you all feel one way or the other about it,
Right.
certainly let us know.
Right. We could write it so that's allowable. Because it's not part of the local character, we're assuming we're starting on the assumption that you probably don't want to see that. We know how to write the regulations to allow that as well, if that's what
Yeah.
the community wants.
And to Bill's point about, communities like Neptune Beach where property values only increase, it's a very desirable location. You will see people trying to get larger and larger homes, kind of max out the building envelope. It's already happening on some lots. And so that was one of the points we made earlier on in the presentation, that sometimes minimums are not enough and you may want to actually also include maximums in certain areas where you want to preserve the more historic fabric of the neighborhood, where you may want to limit the amount of lot aggregations or people coming in and buying 3 lots and then building a much, much larger home than is really what exists today in that area. So that's another thing we can consider, if you don't want to end up with oversized lots and oversized homes in certain areas.
So we have someone, Jonathan Wrighty, that wants to speak, so I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. So I think you should be able to unmute now. Jonathan, are you able to unmute? Oh, there. Sorry, I just clicked it again. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I'm very interested in the discussion of lot coverages and heights, especially in terms of resiliency. So last week we had the second resiliency discussion where the UF extension consultant, I think is Jerry.
Jerry Murphy.
Murphy, yeah. Jerry Murphy discussed the really the near imminent incoming inundation of water from the intercoastal into those properties that are bordering the intercoastal and some of the other low-lying at-risk areas. So thinking about the code and what opportunities are there in order to kind of create trade-offs, maybe to reduce the size of the buildings, to increase the absorptive capability of the land itself. So just since we're going through this code rewrite, I've been giving it some thought and have talked a little bit to some neighbors, but would be interested in the input here. Hence that question about Miami and trying to benchmark other places.
I can't
So
say that.
It's more of a request for your thoughts and discussion for options, and kind of benchmarking best practices around the state or things you're seeing.
Certainly lot coverage is not the only measure. You want to get the amount of permeable versus impermeable surface area allowed on any given property. That's a really key thing to study and ensure is the right amount. And it may be that different parts of the city need different regulations based on where it's located. And, a big part of that is infrastructure as well. It's not just site design on individual properties. What we're seeing, at least in our community here in Miami-Dade County, beginning to raise roads and really and install more pumps and more capacity to the existing stormwater infrastructure, which we know Neptune Beach is starting to do as well. There's obviously a limit to the infrastructure improvements you can make given the tax base of the city and who's really paying for that. So this is a really small community. So there is a question of, how much of that retrofitting and adaptation, which can be quite costly, is possible or makes sense ultimately. And I know Jerry spoke about other tools like transfer of development rights, which could be useful in the future. And I think our recommendation would be certainly to get the site design standards as progressive and responsive to the environment as possible, making sure that the amount of permeable and impermeable surface area is good, making sure that things like building height, that we're not trying to discourage people from elevating their properties because of this arbitrary way that we decided to measure the building height. So you want to make it easier for people to actually go ahead and start adapting their own properties should they want to, and then monitor the situation. I think TDRs could be, which are transfers of development rights away from hazard areas to other urban areas where growth is desirable, is a possible tool. I don't know that it's necessarily a great tool at the moment, but could be in the years to come. Bill, I don't know what you
Yeah.
think.
So when there's a need to, when the flooding becomes more and more common, and there's a need to improve the drainage, you know, the government can do that at really great expense. So when it comes to site design, one of the things that we can do through the code is make sure we don't make the situation, allow the situation to become worse than it would otherwise. So for instance, east of 3rd Street, a lot of people, you know, the lots are small and the blocks are small, and that's all part of the charm. So we look around, you see an awful lot of the parking spaces are either on the grass or on the dirt, or they're on paving stones that are not solid. There's space between them for water to drain in, or there's just 2 strips, you know, one strip for each wheel of the vehicle, and it's grass between. And when you have all those are good, and when you replace that with a, you know, like a single wide driveway of poured concrete or asphalt, then all the water that either comes down in the rain or comes up in a flood, or just pools up from neighbors, no longer can sink in, and it has to go into the public drainage system, which basically takes away that capacity. And so that's, again, something that we see when you get a larger home and, you know, more vehicles, and you find parking areas being paved. And so, you know, we talk about the lot coverage of the building, but often the bigger problem is additional lot coverage coming from the way that you park your way you plan to park your vehicle, or the way, if you're having a outdoor patio, that patio can be permeable and let water drain through between the pavers, or it can be impermeable and all the water has to run off. And if it doesn't run off into the stormwater system, it runs onto your neighbor's property. So we're glad that Jerry Murphy's working on that. He used to be community development director of the town of Fort Myers Beach that had this problem in spades. And he worked through, when he was there, a lot of the different techniques for making sure that, you know, what's to each individual homeowner might just seem like an improvement in their property, but it collectively can be harmful as well, depending on how it's done.
Mm-hmm. There's one more question here from Chris Gooden. That's one aspect people like a lot east of 3rd Street is the eclectic feel of the different homes. So how can we encourage porches on 1st Street while not forcing all the homes to look the same? And I think you can take that, Bill.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for instance, going back to the earlier discussion about setbacks, and we had a couple questions about, does that mean the setback of the building or the setback of the overhang of the roof, or does it the accessory building? For instance, one technique is to, if the front setback is, I don't know what it is in that district, but if it's, you know, 20 feet, that can be changed, say that a porch can come in front of that. The porch, as long as it's open on the sides, it can have a roof, but it can be open on the sides. And that encourages people to take advantage of that and build porches, which are attractive and neighborly, and, you know, improves communication between people sitting on their porch and people, you know, walking by, riding their bikes, in a way that's done by individual people when they want to, if they want to, but is enabled by a fairly minor change in the code that encourages porches because they're good for communityness. So that's the kind of thing that that we can do. There are communities who have, you know, rules that, you know, your fences can't all look alike and your porch railings can't all look alike. And that's something that I don't know if you're interested in doing that, but places do that, and that, you know, it adds to the eclectic feel and spurs creativity, rather than sort of like least common denominator, you know, vinyl porch railings, which are cheap to buy, but they don't add as much as something that's a little more creative. So a lot of those things can be done through these code changes, and the porches is a great example.
And there doesn't have to be just one porch. And of course, we wouldn't have to require a porch. I think
Oh.
having a menu of frontage types that could include a variety of different types of porches, but also forecourts, potentially small courtyard buildings. There's a number of different types that we can define in the code and illustrate so that it's clear to people who are looking to build or renovate in Neptune Beach that there's there's a large menu of options that are appropriate in their area. And of course, the goal of having that is that people will select different things based on their own styles and their own preferences, and that will help kind of preserve the eclectic feel. Great. Well, we are almost at time. Just about.
Do we have any last minute questions, or anyone wants to maybe say a comment or have another question? They want to raise their hand. We have time for one more. Well, we have our meeting next on Thursday for architectural guidelines, so we'll get into more specifics. Please come back and share that with your neighbors, and please check website for this presentation tomorrow. If you want to look back and you have any other questions, let us know.
Yeah, Thursday's meeting will be a shorter meeting like this one, but we'll talk more specifically about architectural styles and different regulations to get more into the actual design and look and feel of a building beyond just your overall, how is the building positioned, how tall is it, how massive is it, which we covered more today. So if you're more interested in that topic, definitely come back. All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.